In this video, I'll talk about freeze-drying technology. I'll take you on a tour of a freeze-drying facility that I've built. I'll talk about what foods work well, what foods do not work as well, how long it takes. I'll then wrap up with an entrepreneur's perspective and what I think are good next steps.
Back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and good reason to fear it.
So let's get started with the facility tour.
The question I ponder is who plans for whom? Do I plan for myself or leave it to you? I want plans by the many, not by the few. Let's not repeat what created our troubles. I want real growth, not a series of bubbles. Stop bailing out losers. Let prices work. If we don't try to steer them, they won't go berserk.
Come on, are you kidding? Don't Wall Street gyrations challenge a worldview of self-regulation? Even you must admit that the lesson we've learned is more oversight's needed or else we'll get burned.
Oversight? The government's long been in bed with those Wall Street execs and the firms that they bled. Capitalism's about profit and loss. You bail at the losers, there's no end to the cause. The lesson I've learned, it's how little we know. The world is complex, not some circular flow. The economy's not a class you can master in college. To think otherwise is the pretense of knowledge.
Welcome to the Glacier Foods freeze-drying facility. Behind me, I have 15 large commercial freeze dryers. I started construction of the facility in spring of 2021 and finished just in time of harvest of that year. Now let's take a look at construction and how we got here.
Back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and good reason to fear it.
I made my case, Freddie H. Listen up, can you hear it?
I'll begin in broad strokes, just like my friend Keynes. His theory conceals the mechanics to change. That simple equation, too much aggregation, ignores human action and motivation. Yet it continues as a justification for bailouts, payoffs, by polls with machinations. You provide them with cover to sell us a free lunch. Then all that we're left with is debt and a bunch. If you're living high on that cheap credit hog, don't look for a cure from the hair of the dog. Real savings come first if you want to invest. The market coordinates time with interest. Your focus on spending is pushing on thread. In the long run, my friend, it's your theory that's dead. So sorry there, buddy, if that sounds like invective. Prepare to get schooled in my Austrian perspective.
We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and good reason to fear it.
Blame low interest rates.
It's the animal spirit.
The place you should study isn't the bust, it's the boom that should make you feel leery. That's the thrust of my theory. The capital structure is key. Malinvestments wreck the economy. The boom gets started with an expansion of credit. The Fed sets rates low. Are you starting to get it? That new money is confused for real loanable funds, but it's just inflation that's driving the ones who invest in new projects like housing construction. The boom plants the seeds for its future destruction. The savings aren't real, consumption's up too, and the grasping for resources reveals there's too few. So the boom turns to bust as the interest rates rise. Where the cost of production price signals relies. The boom was a binge, that's a matter of fact. Now it's devalued capital that makes up the slack. Whether it's the late 20s or 2005, booming bad investments seems like they'd thrive. You must save to invest, don't use the printing press, or a bust will surely follow, an economy depressed. Your so-called stimulus will make things worse. Just more of the same, more incentives perverse. And that credit crunch ain't a liquidity trap, just a broke banking system. I'm done, that's a wrap.
We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom
And here we are with the finished freeze-drying facility. Next, I'll talk about my interests and why I thought it was a good idea to buy one of these machines instead of going out and buying food off of the market. The first reason is availability. Due to government shutdowns in 2020 for reasons,
you must lock down. Productivity is prohibited. You must comply. Resistance is futile.
We have engaged the Borg.
there was an unexpected demand for freeze-dried food, and many store shelves were left empty. It was a logical conclusion that if I had one of these machines, I could produce freeze-dried meals and food independent of that supply chain. The second reason was quality. When I first got one of these machines, I realized that the food that it produces is much better quality than what's available out on store shelves. This is for several reasons, but the primary one is that if you put better food in, you get better food out. The third reason is cost. Per pound and per kilogram, it's much more efficient to produce freeze-dried food on these machines than it is to buy the same equivalent amount from the market. There are several reasons for this, but the primary one is that it reduces expenses. Things like marketing, distribution, bureaucracy, labor, and other administrative overhead are cut. What this leaves is the expense for electricity, the food itself, and my own time. The fourth reason was variety. Most freeze-dried facilities handle 10,000 pounds or more at a minimum. This means that it's a significant investment just to try something small. That, combined with other bureaucratic hoops, especially for meat,
Is non-compliant and dissenting incident has been reported. You must comply or you will be punished.
I gotta do something about that. It limits what's available out on the market. The fifth reason was transparency. The process that's used to freeze dry food on these machines is not hidden behind non-disclosure agreements, walls, or closed doors. This provides confidence to know that the food that's packaged is of great quality. So what is freeze drying? Freeze drying is simply drying at a low temperature inside of a vacuum. Here we have a large commercial freeze dryer from Harvest Rate. Here's a vacuum pump, a vacuum chamber. Each of these shells has a heating element for drying the food. On the outside of the chamber is a evaporator for the refrigeration system, and the condenser is on the inside. This is able to achieve a vacuum of around 500 millitorr, which is the equivalent of 30 miles or 50 kilometers into the atmosphere. And it has capability to go down negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit and negative 40 degrees Celsius. This uses a thermodynamic property of water that can change water from ice to gas, skipping over the liquid phase. As we can show you in this graph here, the freeze dryer will initially freeze the food. It will then do a vacuum freeze, bringing it down in pressure. It will then warm up the food on each of the trays, changing that ice instantly into gas, and eventually leave it dried. This preserves the shape and the taste of the food very well. It also achieves one of the lowest possible water activity levels of food preservation techniques. So what is water activity? Water activity is a measurement of free or available water, and it is different than the measurement of water content. For example, you can lower the water activity while maintaining the same water content. A refrigeration system can lower the temperature, thereby lowering the water activity and better preserve the food. You can also achieve a similar result by adding salts or sugars, reducing the water activity, and this is done with canned foods and goods. As we pull up this graph of an apple and the various ways in which it can be preserved, you can see that a fresh apple requires refrigeration, and then as we move down, we lower water activity and reduce the need for refrigeration or other techniques. Here down at the bottom, we have freeze-dried apples, and as you can see, it is the lowest water activity of all of the techniques. And this makes freeze drying excellent for food safety. Now, I have tried to freeze dry a lot of things. I have a medium-sized Harvest Right freeze dryer at home. And so the next section we will go into is what foods work well and what foods do not work as well. Let's get started with what works well. First up, we have fruit. So this includes apples, pears, blueberries, peaches, nectarines. They all work really good. What you want to do is you want to eat them dry rather than rehydrating them. It doesn't turn out that great. And the flavor is it's a little bit more sweet and crunchy. So, apples, pears, you need to do diced apples. And then there's different packaging, so smaller package with pears. So another thing to mention is, so here we have a gallon-sized bag. This is equivalent of about 8 apples. Now the mass reduction during the freeze drying process is about 10% of what it is originally. So that means that you could probably easily eat more apples than you typically would normally eat. So don't eat too many. Also, if you leave the apples out for too long, they'll absorb moisture from the air. So a jar like this works really great because you can open it up, grab a couple, and reseal it back up to maintain its freshness. Another thing to note is with blueberries, they won't dry all the way unless you poke holes in them. Now there's a great tool for that Frozen Right makes for doing just that. So the next thing I'd like to mention is avocados. So avocados work really great. And you can make a guacamole mix. Add some tomatoes, onions, jalapenos, and you can have instant guacamole on the top of a mountain. Imagine long day hiking, add some water, a couple minutes later you have instant guacamole you can put on your burrito. Fantastic. Okay, so I think that, actually, tomatoes. Also, tomatoes work great. You may not want to add, work good for like a salsa or a sauce in guacamole. So that brings us next to vegetables, mushrooms, and grains. So, unlike fruit, rehydrating
Rehydrated is not a word.
Computer, add rehydrate to dictionary.
Okay, rehydrated has been added to your personal dictionary.
Thank you. Sorry for that. Okay, so yeah, so vegetables you can rehydrate and they hold their structure better. So let's see, like peas, carrots, corn, all work great. You can boil them up or you can saute them. You add the water back into it and they turn out really, really good. Onions also, you can eat these, use these for cooking, or you could just eat them dry. They kind of taste like a onion ring when they're dry. Pretty good. Bell peppers and hot peppers, also great. You can turn the hot pepper into a powder and use it as a seasoning, but be warned, the powder is easily airborne and you want to make sure not to inhale it. Herbs also work great, similar to the powder. You can leave them whole or powder them up and have a great seasoning. It's really, really fresh flavor. Same thing for like ginger, turmeric, and garlic. One thing to note with garlic though is you probably want to grind it up before you freeze dry it. Otherwise, it's pretty difficult to grind up afterwards. But it makes the freshest garlic powder it's just really good fresh garlic powder. Same thing with turmeric and ginger. So beets, beans, and asparagus all work really great. One thing to note with rice is that brown rice works better than white rice. If you do white rice, it kind of turns into a soupy pudding-like texture rather than original like cooked rice. So, but brown rice on their hand handles it fine. And then one thing that's it may not be very common is doing like flour. Flour doesn't have a whole lot of water left, but it does have some water left. So if you freeze dry water and you put it in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber, you could extend the shelf life of that flour even longer for some backup flour. So, next up, we got liquids and dairy. So this includes things like sauces, smoothies, yogurts, milk, almond milk, things like that. All do really well. Cheese, ice cream, and ice cream sandwiches. Ice cream sandwiches you just eat dry. You don't rehydrate those. Cheese you can rehydrate, but it doesn't work that well if the slices are thick. If it's more of like a shredded or a powder, it works better. So that would work better for things like macaroni and cheese and things like that. Bone broth and other broths also work really good. Let's move on to meat. So meat also works well. Now, it needs to be thinly sliced so that it can rehydrate well. Or in cases like shrimp, you can just have whole shrimp and whole cooked shrimp, and then you just, in 20 minutes, you can add you cook shrimp, you add water to it, 20 minutes later you have ready to eat shrimp. You get some cocktail sauce and you're ready to go. You can do that at the top of the mountain if you wanted to. Now, uncooked and cooked hamburger both work, and it really depends on your time preference on, do you want to wait for it to rehydrate in a cold soak, or do you want it more instant? But I think the taste and texture is better with the cold soak than it is with typical hot boiling water over the top, because if you use the hot boiling water, you're kind of cooking it again, or if it's already not cooked yet, you'd be cooking it, but it doesn't let enough time for the water to really get in there. So if you want more thicker slices, the cold soak kind of works better. If you have really thin slices, you could probably go either way. One thing that's one of my favorites is to do a carne asada. And what I do is I freeze dry the marinade with it, so that way when it's rehydrating, you're rehydrating it with the marinade, and then you can cook it up right after that. So imagine being up on a hike, you get to camp, or you do a couple hour beforehand you get to camp, you rehydrate it. By the time you get to camp, you're ready to go, and you can have fresh carne asada at the top of a mountain. So next up, we will go into what does not work as well, and then we'll talk about how long it takes to do all these various different foods. All right, so let's get into what does not work well. First up, cherries. Now, they taste great, but they're technically problematic because of the pits. And you can pit them, but it's like impossible to figure out if they've all had the pits removed. And because it turns into a crunchy texture as it's freeze-dried, you could bite into a pit and it's just not a good combo. Now, next up is grapes. Grapes, you got to cut them so that the water can get out, and it's also problematic technically to cut the grapes. There could be a way. Difficult though. Eggs, I've tried various forms of doing eggs, from raw eggs and then making a scramble, doing cooked eggs, and it just does not work that great. The texture ends up different it's just not the same as a fresh egg. So what I think, eggs could be useful for like as an ingredient into a recipe, or like say, for example, raw eggs, or if you do a scrambled egg and then you mix it with like cooked potatoes and things like that, that would probably work. So some caveats there. Bread, unless you're intending to eat it crunchy, like a biscuit or like a crouton, that could work. But as you rehydrate it, it's just kind of fall apart and lose its form. Raw lettuce for a similar reason. Thick steaks and things like that, it's going to be hard to get the water back into it. There might be a way, but it's very difficult. It's better to have thinly sliced meat. Beans in a pod for a similar reason as grapes. Hard to get the water out. White rice, as I mentioned earlier, because it kind of turns into a soupy pudding type mix. You could, like I said, use brown rice, or if you're intending, to do more of a soup, then that could work. Very sugary liquids. It boils up in the machine and creates a big mess, so technically problematic. You could maybe solve that somehow by experimenting with the right sugar levels so that, wherever it is, but it's difficult to do. And sugary things and it's already preserved, so not a huge loss there, I guess. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is pickled foods. Now, it's probably subjective, but it tastes so much saltier after it's been freeze-dried that I don't think it's any good. And similar to the sugary things, it's already preserved, so moot point. Next up, we will talk about how long it takes to freeze-dry various foods. All right, so let's get into how long it takes to freeze dry. So, general rule is that the more water there is and the more food you put on each tray, the longer it's going to take. So, for example, apples, sliced apples on these machines behind me will take about 36 to 48 hours. Now, diced apples, you can fit about 25% more on each tray, and it takes about the same amount of time. And that's just because the water can escape from the apple. There's more surface area faster. Herbs, for example, take less time, about 12 to 24 hours per cycle. Hamburger patties took about 24 hours, and that's going to have, depending on how thick it's cut and other conditions about how much water there is in there, it's going to vary the times. Another thing that's an important detail to mention is that based on the machine size, it's going to have different times that it will take. So these are large freeze dryers behind me, and as I mentioned, it took 36 to 48 hours, whereas I have a medium-sized unit at home, and the same sliced apples will take 24. And that's an important detail to note if you're trying to calculate how much you can produce in a given amount of time. And we'll get into that in the next section. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, the moment you have been waiting for, my entrepreneur's perspective. Problem number 1, volume. Each of these machines behind me can process about 7 kilograms of sliced apples per cycle every 36 to 48 hours. Combined, that is 105 kilograms per cycle, or 210 to 315 kilograms per week. This facility can currently be run by one person. Now let's take a look at the expenses. As you can see, both the building expenses and labor expenses are the highest. They're even larger than the raw input agricultural product. However, these expenses are not taking into consideration marketing, retail distribution, and other administrative overhead. Given the current prices per gram at retail for freeze-dried apples, this would equal 50% profit margin. However, taking into consideration marketing, retail distribution, at best, it might be a 10 to 25% profit margin. However, there is still low volume. Now, in relation to labor and building expenses, I do not believe that these 15 large commercial freeze dryers can produce enough to have this be a viable standalone business. I believe it would be necessary to double the capacity of these machines by either doubling the vacuum chamber volume that we currently have, or to somehow reduce the cycle times from 36 to 24 hours. This could be possible. However, in doing so, we would need to automate both packaging and more automate slicing so as not to incur further labor expenses. However, these machines would not be running continuously and not a best utilization of their investment. Therefore, not only would we need to double this, we would probably need to even go several times as many so that we could have product moving through and being packaged continuously. Or an alternative to that would be to have a complementary business in which this automation machinery could be run on different unrelated workloads. Therefore, I believe it is important for a freeze-drying business to be combined with a complementary business to best utilize for maximum efficiency. Now, this could work at the small scale or the large scale. For example, a cafe, grocery store, or restaurant could offer a freeze-dried to-go meal that could be taken to the top of a mountain or stored for far longer than would be ordinary. So next, let's talk about problem number 2. Excess heat. These 15 machines behind me can produce the equivalent of about 3 to 5 tons of heat. I am in a 4,000 square foot building with 15-foot ceilings, well-insulated concrete walls and ceiling, and these 15 freeze dryers can heat this facility during winter months in the Pacific Northwest without having to use too much of our heat pump. In the summer months, we would need an additional 3 to 5 tons of cooling to be able to operate year-round in months like June, July, August, and September. So next, let's talk about what has worked well. Success number 1, refrigeration. I have a walk-in freezer and a walk-in cooler, and they're both working great. They have a split system in which the evaporator is on the inside and the condenser is outside the facility. I ordered these from Bar Refrigeration and had Jacobs HVACR install them. I also programmed a robust monitoring system that I can detail in a later video. Success number 2, electricity. Electric rates in this area are 2.95 cents per kilowatt hour, which is one of the lowest in North America. All of the refrigeration equipment, the dishwasher, and the heat pump are all 3-phase that have additional efficiency gains. I had the electric work done by Apple City Electric, and they did a fantastic job. We installed this panel for all of the freeze dryers. Success number 3, disintermediation. This facility has been designed to have a secure supply chain. We have very few external dependencies. From harvest bin to final packaging, we are able to do the entire process here at the facility. This provides us an opportunity to make efficiency gains. For example, when apples are sliced, they're put onto trays and then immediately frozen to preserve freshness, and then later freeze-dried. We are also able to sell directly to customers using the Bitcoin Lightning Network, a peer-to-peer network for decentralized payments. And that brings us to the fourth and final success that I will talk about in this video, and that is food safety. I have robust 24/7 monitoring of the refrigeration systems. We use hypochlorous acid, aka electrolyzed water. It is many times more effective than typical solutions such as sodium hypochlorite. It is also very safe to use. We do water treatment here at the facility, including a carbon filter, water softening, and a UV light. Floors and walls have all been sealed. We have hands-free dedicated hand wash sinks, dedicated mop sink and laundry, and even a hands-free restroom. That brings us to next steps. What do I think will work well for these machines? Use existing space more efficiently. For example, a business such as a commercial kitchen, cafe, grocery store, butcher shop could add one or two of these machines without having any additional expenses for the space. Use time more efficiently. If there are slow or idle times, this time could be used to load and unload these trays. This could also mean a more efficient use of food product. Avoid issues with cooling by only having a couple machines that won't overload existing cooling and ventilation systems. Cut expenses for marketing, advertising, and distribution by adding value to existing products and services. For example, a restaurant that has a to-go option for hikes and hunting. If you have an interest in buying a freeze dryer, new or used, if you'd like to buy freeze-dried apples, or if you have a general interest, contact me at braydon@glacierfoods.com. That's BRAYDON at glacierfoods.com. This concludes the video. I will have another video coming up later that will detail a robust monitoring system for refrigeration that I have programmed. It uses Arduinos, power over Ethernet shields, and thermistors. So stay tuned. Thank you very much, and until next time.